I am Maya Chun, 28 years old, and I just woke up from emergency surgery to find my hospital room empty. My parents had promised they would be there when I opened my eyes, but they had left without a word. What they did not know was that Alexander Thornton, the billionaire CEO of Thornton Global Industries and the man whose company I had been secretly helping to build for the past 4 years, was about to walk through that door and reveal everything I had been hiding from my family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The heart monitor beeped steadily as the truth prepared to shatter the carefully constructed lies I had maintained for years. Before I tell you how my entire family discovered the career I had been hiding and the life I had built in secret, drop a comment letting me know where you are watching from. And do not forget to subscribe for more stories about following your dreams and standing up for yourself despite impossible family expectations. The fluorescent lights of Mercy General Hospital cast harsh shadows across the sterile white walls of my recovery room. My throat felt raw from the breathing tube, and every movement sent sharp pains through my abdomen where the surgeons had removed my appendix just hours earlier. The anesthesia still clouded my thoughts, making everything feel distant and unreal, like I was watching my life happen to someone else. I reached for the call button, my hand trembling with weakness and something else, the creeping realization that I was completely alone. The chair beside my bed sat empty, the blanket my mother had been holding folded neatly on the seat. My father's coffee cup remained on the side table, still half full, as if he had left in a hurry. No note, no explanation, just absence where promises had been made. The appendicitis had struck without warning during what should have been a routine Saturday morning. I had been at my apartment, reviewing quarterly reports for the Strategic Initiatives Division I secretly led at Thornton Global, when the pain began. At first, I dismissed it as stress or perhaps something I had eaten. But within an hour, the cramping had become so severe that I could barely stand. My roommate Jessica found me collapsed on the bathroom floor and called an ambulance despite my protests. The emergency room doctor took one look at my elevated white blood cell count and the CT scan results and informed me that I needed immediate surgery. My appendix was inflamed and dangerously close to rupturing. There was no time to delay, no opportunity to carefully manage the situation as I had managed every other aspect of my double life for the past 4 years. I had called my parents from the preoperative area, my voice shaking as I explained that I was having emergency surgery, and asked if they could come to the hospital. My mother Patricia had gasped audibly, immediately launching into a series of frantic questions about what had happened and whether I had been taking proper care of myself. My father Richard had taken the phone from her, his voice steady and reassuring as he promised they would leave immediately and be there when I woke up. That promise now sat broken in the empty chair beside my bed. I understood on some level why they had left. My parents had never been comfortable with illness or medical situations. When I was 12 and broke my arm falling from a tree, my father had dropped me at the emergency room entrance and waited in the parking lot because he could not stand the sight of hospitals. My mother had stayed with me but spent the entire time wringing her hands and asking the doctors if they were absolutely certain they knew what they were doing. But understanding their discomfort did not diminish the ache of waking up alone after surgery, vulnerable and frightened, to find that the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had once again chosen their own comfort over my needs. The door to my room opened suddenly, and a nurse entered, her expression professional but warm. She checked my vital signs and asked about my pain level, adjusting my 4 medication when I admitted that the discomfort was becoming difficult to manage. As she worked, she chatted pleasantly about the weather, and how lucky I was that my appendix had not ruptured before surgery. "Your family stepped out for a bit," she said, misinterpreting my glances toward the empty chair. "I am sure they will be back soon. Surgery is stressful for everyone." I did not correct her assumption. It was easier to let her believe my family had simply needed a break, rather than admitting they had abandoned me entirely. The truth was too complicated, too revealing of the fundamental dysfunction that had shaped every major decision of my adult life. My phone buzzed on the table beside me, and I reached for it carefully, wincing at the pull on my incision. 3 missed calls from Jessica. 2 text messages from my colleague David asking if I was okay. And 1 message from my mother, sent an hour ago, that made my stomach clench with a familiar mixture of hurt and resignation. Had to leave, sweetheart. Your father was not feeling well, and the hospital environment was making him anxious. You are in good hands with the doctors. Call us when you are discharged and we will arrange to pick you up. Make sure you follow all the instructions they give you. Love, Mom. Not feeling well. The words echoed in my mind with bitter irony. I was the one who had just had emergency surgery, but my father's discomfort with hospitals had taken precedence over my need for support during a frightening medical crisis. It was such a perfect encapsulation of my entire relationship with my parents that I might have laughed if it would not have hurt so much. I had grown up as the only child of Richard and Patricia Chan, first-generation immigrants who had built a modest but comfortable life through relentless hard work and careful planning. My father owned a small accounting firm that served local businesses in our suburban New Jersey community. My mother worked as a translator, moving between Mandarin, Cantonese, and English with effortless fluency. They had achieved the American dream through conventional means, and they expected me to follow an equally conventional path. That path had been mapped out for me before I was old enough to have opinions about my own future. I would study hard, earn perfect grades, attend a prestigious university, and pursue a stable, respectable career. Medicine, law, or finance were the acceptable options. My parents particularly favored medicine, believing that a doctor in the family would represent the pinnacle of immigrant success. I had tried to follow their script. Throughout elementary and middle school, I was the model daughter, bringing home report cards filled with the grades and teacher comments praising my diligence and focus. I joined academic clubs, competed in math competitions, and spent my weekends studying while my classmates went to movies or hung out at the mall. The approval in my parents' eyes when I won academic awards felt like the only validation that mattered. But something shifted during high school. I discovered an aptitude and passion for business strategy that felt fundamentally different from my dutiful achievement in other subjects. When we did a project on entrepreneurship in my economics class, I found myself energized in a way I had never experienced before. I spent hours researching business models, analyzing market trends, and developing strategic plans that went far beyond the assignment requirements. My economics teacher, Mr. Harrison, noticed my enthusiasm and encouraged me to enter a statewide business competition. I developed a comprehensive strategy for a fictional company entering the renewable energy market, complete with financial projections, marketing plans, and risk analysis. When I won first place, earning a scholarship to a summer business program at NYU, I felt a sense of accomplishment that was entirely my own, rather than simply meeting someone else's expectations. I had been so excited to share this achievement with my parents. I remember running into the house after school, waving the acceptance letter and scholarship information, certain they would be proud of my initiative and success. Instead, my mother had frowned and asked why I was wasting time on business games when I should be focusing on science and math to prepare for medical school. My father had been more direct. Business is for people who cannot do anything else, he had said, barely looking up from the tax returns he was reviewing. You are smart enough for medicine, Maya. Do not settle for less. That moment had planted a seed of rebellion that would eventually grow into the carefully hidden life I now led. But at 16, I did not yet have the courage or resources to openly defy my parents. Instead, I attended the summer program without telling them what it truly involved, claiming it was a general academic enrichment opportunity. I continued to take the advanced science courses they expected while secretly devouring business books and case studies in my spare time. When it came time to apply for college, the conflict between my desires and their expectations reached a crisis point. I wanted to apply to business programs at schools like Penn, Michigan, and USC. They insisted I apply only to schools with strong pre-medical programs, and made it clear they would only provide financial support if I pursued the path they had chosen for me. I was not brave enough then to strike out entirely on my own. I compromised, applying to schools that offered both strong science programs and business schools, with the vague hope that I might be able to switch majors once I was there. I was accepted to several excellent universities and ultimately chose Northwestern, partly because of its strong academics and partly because it was far enough from home to provide some breathing room. My parents had been pleased with my choice, interpreting it as commitment to their vision for my future. They helped me move into my freshman dorm, my mother fussing over whether I had enough warm clothes for Chicago winters, and my father lecturing me about the importance of maintaining a high GPA for medical school applications. I smiled and nodded, already planning how I would navigate the next 4 years. Freshman year was a careful balancing act. I enrolled in the required pre-medical courses, earning the grades my parents expected when they called to check on my progress. But I also took Introduction to Business Strategy as an elective, telling my parents it was a general education requirement. That single course changed everything. The professor, Dr. Susan Martinez, was a former management consultant who brought real-world case studies into the classroom with infectious enthusiasm. We analyzed struggling companies, identified strategic opportunities, and developed turnaround plans. For the first time in my academic career, I felt like I was learning something that made my mind come alive rather than simply memorizing information to regurgitate on exams. Dr. Martinez noticed my engagement and asked me to stay after class one day. She told me I had a natural aptitude for strategic thinking and asked if I had considered pursuing business more seriously. When I explained my situation, the conflict between my interests and my parents' expectations, she did not dismiss my concerns or tell me to simply follow my passion regardless of consequences. Instead, she offered practical advice. She suggested I could continue with pre-medical courses while adding business classes, keeping my options open. She mentioned internship opportunities and networking events that might help me explore whether business was truly the right path. Most importantly, she validated my interest as legitimate and worthwhile, providing the encouragement I had never received from my parents. I followed her advice, carefully constructing a double major in biology and economics. I told my parents only about the biology major, framing the economics courses as helpful for understanding healthcare systems and hospital management. The deception felt necessary for survival, though it also planted the seeds of guilt that would follow me for years. The summer after my sophomore year, Dr. Martinez connected me with an internship opportunity at a management consulting firm in Chicago. The position was unpaid, but it offered invaluable experience working on real strategy projects for actual companies. I told my parents I had secured a research position at a hospital laboratory, a lie that came frighteningly easily after 2 years of practice. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That internship transformed my understanding of what I wanted to do with my life. I worked alongside analysts who were brilliant, driven, and passionate about solving complex business problems. The projects were challenging and exhausting, often requiring 12-hour days and weekend work, but I loved every minute of it. I felt competent and capable in ways I never had in organic chemistry lab or anatomy class. One of the senior partners at the firm, Michael Zhang, took an interest in my work. He was a second-generation Chinese American who had faced similar family pressure to pursue medicine before ultimately following his own path into business. He understood the cultural complexities of my situation in ways that my white classmates could not, and he offered mentorship that extended beyond professional advice. "Your parents want security for you," he told me over coffee one afternoon. "They are not wrong that medicine offers that, but they are wrong if they think it is the only path to a stable, successful life. The question you need to answer is whether you are willing to fight for what you want or if you will let their fears determine your future." His words haunted me throughout my junior year, as I continued to maintain my double major, while growing increasingly miserable in my science courses. I was still earning good grades through sheer determination, but the passion and curiosity that had once driven my academic achievement had evaporated. I studied molecular biology not because I found it fascinating but because I was supposed to, because it was part of the script my parents had written for my life. Meanwhile, my business courses felt like oxygen after being underwater. I could not get enough of case studies, strategic frameworks, competitive analysis, and market dynamics. I started writing papers that went far beyond course requirements simply because I wanted to explore ideas more deeply. My professors began suggesting I consider pursuing an MBA or entering a strategy-focused doctoral program. The breaking point came during the spring of my junior year, when I received 2 significant opportunities simultaneously. I was accepted into a highly competitive summer internship at Thornton Global Industries, one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the world, working directly with their strategic planning division. At the same time, I secured a position in a neuroscience research lab that my parents believed would be perfect for my medical school applications. I had to make a choice, and for the first time I chose what I truly wanted over what was expected of me. I accepted the position at Thornton Global, and told my parents I would be spending the summer doing medical research in California, carefully omitting the fact that my research would involve business strategy rather than biological science. That summer at Thornton Global was the beginning of everything. The career I had secretly built, the life I had carefully hidden, and the relationship with Alexander Thornton that would eventually force all my worlds to collide in the most unexpected way possible. But as I lay in that hospital bed, still groggy from anesthesia and aching from surgery, I could not have anticipated that the collision was about to happen much sooner and far more dramatically than I had ever imagined. The door to my room opened again, and I expected to see another nurse or perhaps a doctor checking on my recovery. Instead, Alexander Thornton walked through the door, his expression tight with concern, his presence filling the small room with an intensity that made my heart rate spike on the monitor. He was supposed to be in London for a series of investor meetings. He was not supposed to know I was in the hospital at all, and he absolutely was not supposed to be standing beside my bed, holding a bouquet of white orchids and looking at me with an emotion I could not quite identify but that made my breath catch despite the circumstances. "Maya," he said quietly, his voice carrying the slight British accent he had acquired during years living in London before returning to the United States to run his company. "Jessica called me. Why did you not tell me you were having surgery?" I stared at him, my mind racing through possibilities and implications. Jessica knew I worked at Thornton Global, but she did not know the specifics of my role or my relationship with Alexander. She certainly did not know that I was the architect behind many of the strategic initiatives that had driven the company's explosive growth over the past 4 years, or that Alexander and I had developed a connection that had slowly evolved from professional respect into something neither of us had fully acknowledged or acted upon. "How did you get Jessica's number?" I asked, my voice hoarse from the breathing tube. It was an absurd thing to focus on given the situation, but my mind was still foggy from anesthesia and struggling to process the impossibility of his presence. "Your emergency contact information in our company database lists her as your roommate," he said, setting the orchids on the table beside my bed. "When you did not show up for our Monday morning strategy meeting and did not respond to messages, I called her to make sure you were all right. She told me you were here." The pieces began fitting together. Today was Monday. I had lost track of time between the Saturday morning emergency and the surgery. Of course Alexander would have noticed my absence from our weekly strategy meeting. We had been working on a critical acquisition deal that required careful coordination and precise timing. My unexplained absence would have raised immediate red flags. "You should not have come," I said, though part of me felt a warmth spreading through my chest that had nothing to do with the pain medication. "You are supposed to be in London closing the Pemberton deal." "I rescheduled," he said simply, pulling the chair closer to my bed and sitting down. "The deal can wait a few days. You are more important." Those words hung in the air between us, laden with implications neither of us was prepared to fully address. Our relationship had always maintained careful professional boundaries, even as it deepened into genuine friendship and mutual respect. We spent hours together each week discussing strategy, debating approaches, challenging each other's assumptions. We had inside jokes and shared meals and occasionally stayed late at the office talking about things that had nothing to do with business. But we had never crossed the line into anything explicitly personal or romantic. Alexander was not just my boss but the founder and CEO of a company worth billions. I was an employee who had carefully hidden her true role from her family, because they would never understand or approve. The power dynamics, the professional complications, and my own complicated family situation had kept us both from acknowledging what had been growing between us. "Your parents," he said, noticing the empty chair and the half-drunk coffee. "Are they here?" I hesitated, debating whether to offer the comfortable lie or admit the humiliating truth. The anesthesia had lowered my usual defenses, and I found myself telling him what I had not planned to share with anyone. "They left," I said quietly. "My father does not do well in hospitals. They said they would be here when I woke up, but they could not handle it." Something flashed across Alexander's face, anger or perhaps recognition. His own parents had died when he was young, killed in a car accident that had left him orphaned at 15 and eventually led to him building his first company before he was 20. He had often spoken about the complexity of family relationships and the ways people fail each other despite genuinely caring. "Then it is good I came," he said, his tone careful and controlled. "You should not be alone right now." We sat in silence for a moment, the machines beeping steadily in the background. I was acutely aware of how vulnerable I must look, pale and weak in a hospital gown, my hair unwashed and my face bare of the professional polish I normally maintained. But Alexander's presence felt steadying rather than uncomfortable, anchoring me in a way my parents' absence had not. "Does your family know about your real job?" he asked suddenly, his question cutting through my foggy thoughts. "About what you actually do at Thornton Global?" I shook my head slightly, the movement sending a wave of dizziness through me. "They think I work as a junior marketing coordinator. They have no idea about the strategic planning division or my role in company expansion or any of it. They still believe I am going to apply to medical school eventually." Alexander leaned back in his chair, processing this information. He had known my parents did not fully support my career choices, but I had never explained the full extent of the deception I had maintained. The fact that I was revealing it now, vulnerable and drugged and emotionally raw from my parents' abandonment, felt significant in ways I was not yet ready to examine. "How long can you maintain that?" he asked, not judgmentally but with genuine curiosity. "Living two completely separate lives?" "I do not know," I admitted. "Sometimes I think I can keep it going forever. Other times I wonder if I am just delaying an inevitable explosion." He was quiet for a moment, his sharp mind clearly working through implications and scenarios. This was one of the things I most appreciated about Alexander. He did not rush to judgment or offer easy reassurances. He thought carefully before speaking, considering multiple perspectives and possibilities. "What happens if they find out?" he finally asked. "I do not know that either," I said, feeling tears prick at my eyes for the first time since waking up. "They will be devastated, betrayed. They have sacrificed so much to give me opportunities, and from their perspective, I have thrown it all away to pursue something they see as beneath me." "Is their approval worth living a lie?" Alexander asked gently. It was the question I had been avoiding for 4 years, the one that kept me awake at night and made me question every decision I had made. Was maintaining their conditional love worth the constant stress of deception? Was their vision of my future more important than my own happiness and fulfillment? Before I could answer, the door opened again, and a doctor entered to check on my recovery. Alexander stood immediately, stepping back to give the medical team space to work. The doctor examined my incision, asked questions about my pain and symptoms, and declared that I was recovering well. I would need to stay overnight for observation but could likely go home the following day if everything continued to progress normally. As the doctor left, I realized that I would need someone to pick me up when I was discharged. My parents had offered to arrange transportation, but the thought of calling them, of pretending that their abandonment had not hurt, felt unbearable in my current state. "I will take you home tomorrow," Alexander said, reading my thoughts with the intuition that had developed over years of working closely together. "And before you argue that it is not appropriate or necessary, consider that I am not asking. I am telling you that I will be here to drive you home and make sure you are settled safely." There was something in his tone, a firmness that brooked no argument but also a tenderness that made my throat tight with emotion. This man, who ran a billion-dollar company and had investor meetings in London and 1,000 demands on his time and attention, had rescheduled everything to sit beside my hospital bed because he cared about my well-being. "Thank you," I whispered, unable to say anything more without breaking down completely. We talked for another hour, carefully avoiding anything too heavy or emotional, discussing instead the Pemberton acquisition and some strategic questions about our Asia-Pacific expansion. It felt absurdly normal, conducting a business strategy session from my hospital bed, while I was dressed in a flimsy gown and hooked up 2 and 4. But it was also comforting, a reminder that some parts of my life remained stable, even when others felt chaotic and uncertain. Eventually, a nurse came to inform me that visiting hours were ending and that I should rest. Alexander stood reluctantly, clearly torn between following hospital rules and his obvious reluctance to leave me alone. "I will be back first thing in the morning," he promised. Call me if you need anything at all. Even if it is just 3 in the morning and you want someone to talk to. I mean that, Maya. After he left, I lay in the darkness of my hospital room, my mind racing despite my body's exhaustion. The pain medication was making everything feel distant and dreamlike, but certain truths were becoming unavoidably clear. I could not maintain my double life indefinitely. The strain was becoming unsustainable, the lies more elaborate and difficult to track. Eventually, my two worlds would collide, and when they did, I would be forced to make choices I had been avoiding for years. My phone buzzed again. Another message from my mother asking how I was feeling and reminding me to get lots of rest. The casual tone, as if nothing significant had happened, as if they had not broken their promise and left me alone during a frightening medical crisis, made something inside me crack. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of my anger at their selfishness, their consistent prioritization of their comfort over my needs, their conditional love that demanded I sacrifice my authentic self to maintain their approval. I had spent so many years making excuses for them, explaining away their limitations and trying to be the perfect daughter who never caused problems or made demands. But lying in that hospital bed, abandoned and afraid, with only my billionaire boss showing up to make sure I was okay, I began to question whether their approval was worth what I had been paying for it. I did not know it yet, but the collision between my worlds was coming much sooner than I imagined. My parents would discover the truth about my career in the most dramatic way possible, forcing me to finally choose between the life they had planned for me and the one I had been secretly building. And when that moment came, I would have to find the courage to stand up for myself, to defend my choices, and to accept that sometimes loving yourself means risking the loss of others' love. But that confrontation was still ahead of me. For now, I simply closed my eyes and let the pain medication pull me toward sleep. Alexander's orchids on the table beside me, their delicate petals a reminder that someone saw me for who I truly was and valued that person enough to show up when it mattered most. The morning light filtered through the hospital blinds, casting striped shadows across my room when I woke to the sound of soft conversation outside my door. My body felt heavy and sore, each breath reminding me of the incision beneath the bandages. For a moment I forgot where I was or why, and then the events of the previous day came rushing back with uncomfortable clarity. Alexander had promised to return first thing in the morning, but I had not expected him to be standing in the hallway discussing my care with my surgical team at 7 in the morning. Through the partially open door I could hear his voice, polite but insistent, asking detailed questions about my recovery timeline, medication protocols, and what signs of complications he should watch for once I was discharged. The nurse who had cared for me the previous evening poked her head into my room and smiled when she saw I was awake. She entered with a cheerful efficiency that seemed at odds with the early hour, checking my vital signs and asking about my pain level before adjusting my medication. "Your husband is very thorough," she commented as she made notes on her tablet. "He has been here since 6:30 making sure we have everything arranged for your discharge." I opened my mouth to correct her assumption, but the words stuck in my throat. Explaining that Alexander was actually my boss, that we had never even been on a date, that our relationship existed in some undefined space between professional and personal, seemed far too complicated for my foggy morning brain to articulate. Instead, I simply nodded and accepted the cup of water she offered me. Alexander entered a few minutes later, carrying a bag from the upscale cafe 3 blocks from the hospital. The fact that he knew which cafe would be open early and would have food I could actually eat given my post-surgical dietary restrictions spoke to an attention to detail that was characteristic of everything he did. "How are you feeling?" he asked, setting the bag on my bedside table and pulling the chair close to my bed. He looked tired, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he had not slept well, but his concern was evident in every line of his expression. "Sore. Tired. Grateful you are here," I admitted, the honesty coming more easily than it would have under normal circumstances. Something about the vulnerability of illness and the intimacy of his presence in such a private moment had lowered my usual defenses. We ate breakfast together in comfortable silence, the normalcy of sharing a meal somehow making the strangeness of the situation feel less overwhelming. Alexander had brought me oatmeal with berries and honey, exactly what I would have chosen for myself, along with herbal tea that was gentle on my recovering system. For himself, he had black coffee and a croissant, his usual breakfast when we had early morning strategy meetings. "I spoke with your surgical team," he said after a while. "They are happy with your recovery progress. You can be discharged this afternoon as long as you have someone to stay with you for the first 24 hours. I have already cleared my schedule for the rest of the week." "Alexander, you cannot do that," I protested weakly. "You have the Pemberton deal, the board meeting on Thursday, the Singapore expansion review. David can handle Pemberton. The board meeting can be moved to video conference. And Singapore can wait until next week," he said with the calm authority that made him such an effective leader. "Right now, making sure you recover properly is more important than any of those things." I wanted to argue, to insist that I would be fine and that he should return to running his company. But the truth was that I did not want to be alone, and I certainly did not want to call my parents and pretend that their abandonment had not deeply hurt me. The prospect of Alexander staying to help me through the first difficult days of recovery felt like a gift I did not deserve but desperately wanted to accept. My phone rang suddenly, the shrill tone making both of us jump. I glanced at the screen and felt my stomach clench when I saw my mother's name. Alexander noticed my hesitation and squeezed my hand briefly before standing to give me privacy. I answered on the fourth ring, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Maya, sweetheart, how are you feeling this morning?" my mother asked, her voice bright with forced cheerfulness that did not quite mask the underlying guilt. "I am okay, Mom. Sore, but the doctors say I am recovering well." "Oh, good, good. Your father was so worried. You know how he gets about hospitals. He barely slept last night thinking about you." The subtle redirection was so practiced, so familiar, that I almost missed it. Within 2 sentences, she had transformed the narrative from their abandonment of me to their worry about me, making their feelings the center of the story, rather than my experience. "The doctors are discharging me this afternoon," I said, deliberately not offering information about my plans. "Wonderful. We will drive up to get you. What time should we be there?" The assumption that they would be my caregivers, that their brief abandonment would be forgiven and forgotten, sparked something sharp and unfamiliar in my chest. "That is not necessary. I have arranged for someone else to drive me home and stay with me." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with surprise and something else that might have been hurt or might have been offense. My mother was not accustomed to me making arrangements without consulting her or accepting help from sources she had not approved. "Someone else? Who?" "Jessica." She pronounced my roommate's name with the slight disdain she reserved for people she considered insufficiently accomplished or from inadequate backgrounds. Jessica's parents were divorced, and her mother worked as a hairstylist, facts that my mother had somehow learned and never forgotten. "A friend from work," I said vaguely, unwilling to explain further. "Maya, you cannot impose on co-workers for something like this. We are your family. We should be the ones taking care of you." The irony of this statement, given that they had literally left me alone in the hospital after promising to stay, was apparently lost on her. "I am not imposing, Mom. This person offered and I accepted. I appreciate you calling to check on me, but I need to go now. The nurse is here with my medication." It was a lie, but a necessary one to end a conversation that was rapidly becoming more stressful than my actual surgery. "Well, if that is what you want," my mother said, her tone shifting to the particular flavor of hurt that was designed to make me feel guilty for disappointing her. "Your father and I were just trying to help, but if you prefer strangers to your own family, I suppose that is your choice." I ended the call before she could continue, feeling shaky and nauseated in a way that had nothing to do with my physical recovery. Alexander returned to the room a moment later, his expression carefully neutral as he assessed my emotional state. "That sounded difficult," he observed, settling back into his chair. "My mother has a gift for making everything about her feelings while simultaneously making me feel guilty for having feelings of my own," I said, surprised by my own candor. I had never spoken so directly about my family dynamics with anyone, certainly not with my boss, regardless of how close we had become. Alexander was quiet for a moment, his sharp mind clearly processing what I had revealed. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but direct in a way I had come to appreciate about him. "Can I ask you something, Maya? And I want you to know you can tell me if it is too personal or if you would rather not discuss it." I nodded, bracing myself for whatever question was coming. "Why do you let them treat you this way?" You are one of the most brilliant strategic minds I have ever worked with. You built the framework for our entire Asia-Pacific expansion. You identified the opportunity in renewable infrastructure financing that is projected to generate hundreds of millions in revenue. You have contributed more to Thornton Global's success in 4 years than most executives do in their entire careers. He paused, his eyes searching mine. So why do you accept being made to feel small by people who do not even know who you really are? The question hit me with unexpected force, not because it was cruel but because it was true. I had been asking myself variations of that same question for years without ever finding a satisfactory answer. The silence stretched between us as I struggled to articulate something I had never fully examined. Because they are my parents, I finally said, the words feeling inadequate even as I spoke them. Because they sacrificed everything to come to this country and build a life here. Because they worked 16-hour days so I could have opportunities they never had. Because immigrant parents carry expectations that are so heavy, so absolute, that disappointing them feels like a moral failure rather than just a difference of opinion. Alexander listened without interrupting, giving my words the weight they deserved rather than rushing to offer solutions or reassurances. When I finished, he leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. My parents died when I was 15, he said quietly. Car accident on the M1. One moment I had a normal family, annoying little sister, parents who embarrassed me at school functions, the whole ordinary package. The next moment I was an orphan being raised by an aunt who resented the disruption to her life. He paused, his gaze distant with memory. For years after they died, I idealized them, remembered only the good parts and convinced myself that if they had lived, everything would have been perfect. It took me a long time to recognize that they were just people, flawed and complex like everyone else. Loving them did not require pretending they were perfect. And their sacrifices, which were real and significant, did not obligate me to live my life according to their vision rather than my own. I had known the basic facts about Alexander's parents, but he had never spoken about them in such detail or with such vulnerability. The parallel he was drawing was clear, but it was the gentleness with which he offered it that made my eyes sting with tears I refused to shed. The difference is that your parents would probably be proud of what you have built, I said. Mine will see my choices as betrayal of everything they worked for. Perhaps, Alexander acknowledged. Or perhaps they will surprise you. People are capable of growth and change when confronted with realities they can no longer ignore. But even if they do not change, even if they never accept your choices, that does not make your choices wrong. You have built an extraordinary career doing work you love and are brilliant at. That has value independent of whether your parents recognize it. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a text message from my father. It was shorter than my mother's communication, and somehow more cutting because of its brevity. Your mother is upset. We tried to be there for you. But you made us feel unwelcome. Perhaps when you are feeling better, you can apologize for being ungrateful. We will talk when you are ready to be reasonable. I showed the message to Alexander, too tired and sore to maintain the pretense that my family dynamics were normal or healthy. He read it carefully, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. That is manipulation, he said flatly. They abandoned you during a medical crisis, and now they are framing your hurt and disappointment as ingratitude. That is not how people who genuinely love you should treat you, Maya. Hearing someone else name the dynamic I had lived with my entire life was both validating and destabilizing. I had spent so many years making excuses for my parents, explaining away their behavior with cultural context and immigrant trauma, that having someone simply call it what it was felt like having the ground shift beneath my feet. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of medical procedures and discharge preparations. Alexander handled everything with quiet efficiency, speaking with nurses about prescription pickups and follow-up appointments, arranging for my belongings to be gathered, and generally managing the logistics that I was too exhausted to handle myself. By early afternoon, I was dressed in the clothes Jessica had dropped off the previous evening and sitting in a wheelchair per hospital policy, waiting for Alexander to bring his car around. The nurse who had cared for me throughout my stay smiled warmly as she wheeled me toward the exit. You are lucky to have such an attentive husband, she said, clearly still operating under the assumption she had formed earlier. Not all men are willing to put their work aside to care for their wives. This time I did correct her, though my motivation was more about honesty than propriety. He is not my husband. He is my boss. But you are right that I am lucky he is here. The nurse's eyebrows rose slightly, and I could see her recalibrating her understanding of the situation. Well then you are lucky to have such a caring boss. That is quite rare in my experience. Alexander's black Mercedes pulled up to the entrance, and he was out of the car in seconds, opening the passenger door and helping me transfer from the wheelchair with a gentleness that suggested he had experience caring for someone vulnerable. Once I was settled with pillows arranged to protect my incision, he thanked the nurse and drove away from the hospital with careful attention to every bump and turn that might cause me discomfort. Where are we going? I asked, suddenly realizing I had not specified a destination. My place, he said calmly, as if this was the most obvious arrangement in the world. Your apartment is on the 3rd floor with no elevator, and you are not supposed to climb stairs for at least a week. My building has elevator access, and I have a guest room on the ground floor. It makes more sense logistically. The fact that he had apparently researched the recovery guidelines carefully enough to know about stair restrictions touched me more than I wanted to admit. I should have protested, should have insisted that staying at my boss's home was inappropriate regardless of the circumstances. But I was too tired and too grateful to argue. Alexander's apartment was in one of the most exclusive buildings in the city, a modern high-rise with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the skyline. The guest room he had prepared for me was larger than my entire bedroom at home, decorated in soothing neutrals with a bathroom en suite, and a comfortable armchair positioned near the windows. He had clearly spent the morning making preparations. Fresh flowers sat on the dresser, the same white orchids he had brought to the hospital. The bedside table held bottles of water, my prescription medications with a printed schedule for taking them, and a small bell with a note that read, "Ring if you need anything. I will hear it." This is too much, I said, overwhelmed by the care evident in every detail. It is exactly enough, Alexander replied firmly. Now you need to rest. I will be in my office if you need anything, but the bell should reach me anywhere in the apartment. Do not try to be stoic or independent. If you need help, ask for it. I settled into the impossibly comfortable bed, my body sighing with relief as I found a position that minimized the pull on my incision. Alexander lingered in the doorway for a moment, and I could see him wrestling with something he wanted to say. Maya, he finally began, his voice careful. What your parents did, leaving you alone in the hospital, sending those messages blaming you for their choices, that is not okay. You know that, right? That is not normal or acceptable family behavior, regardless of cultural context or generational differences. I wanted to defend them, to offer the explanations I had rehearsed 1,000 times about immigrant parent expectations and the sacrifices that created obligations. But lying in a bed in his apartment, cared for by someone who barely knew my parents but had shown up when they had not, the defenses felt hollow. I know, I whispered. I have known for a long time. I just did not want to admit it because then I would have to do something about it. Alexander nodded slowly, understanding passing between us without need for further words. Get some rest. We can talk more when you are feeling stronger. After he left, I lay in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, my mind drifting between sleep and waking thoughts. I found myself remembering specific moments from my childhood, memories I had carefully filed away or reframed to fit a more comfortable narrative. I remember being 8 years old and winning a school art competition for a painting of our neighborhood. I had been so proud, so excited to show my parents the ribbon I had earned. My father had glanced at it briefly before returning to his accounting work, commenting that art was fine as a hobby but not something serious people pursued. My mother had hung the painting in the basement laundry room, where no guests would see it, explaining that the living room walls were reserved for family photos and important documents. I remember being 12 and wanting to attend a summer camp focused on entrepreneurship and innovation. The camp cost money my parents could afford but considered wasteful. They had sent me instead to a math and science academy, ignoring my tears and protests, insisting they knew what was best for my future. I had stopped arguing after the first week, learning the futility of advocating for my own desires when they conflicted with their vision. I remember being 16 and having my first serious boyfriend, a kind boy named Daniel who played guitar and wrote poetry. My parents had barely concealed their disdain, questioning his college prospects and his family's professional credentials. When we broke up 6 months later, my mother had actually seemed pleased, commenting that I could now focus on important things rather than silly teenage distractions. Each memory, examined honestly rather than through the filter of dutiful daughter narratives, revealed a pattern of dismissal and control that I had spent my entire adult life trying to escape while simultaneously seeking their approval. My phone buzzed with another message, this time from my mother. Maya, please call when you are settled. We need to discuss your attitude and lack of gratitude. This behavior is unacceptable. I stared at the message for a long time before setting the phone aside without responding. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to feel angry at them rather than at myself for disappointing them. The anger felt unfamiliar and uncomfortable, but also strangely liberating. Like removing a weight I had carried for so long, I had forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. I slept fitfully throughout the afternoon, waking periodically to find Alexander checking on me, bringing water or adjusting pillows or simply sitting quietly nearby working on his laptop. His presence was comforting in a way I had not experienced before, care offered without expectation of gratitude or compliance, help given simply because I needed it, rather than as leverage for future obligations. As evening approached and pain medication made everything soft and distant, I found myself thinking about the question Alexander had asked earlier. Why did I accept being made to feel small by people who did not know who I really was? The answer I was beginning to recognize was that I had been afraid. Afraid of losing their love, afraid of being alone, afraid of admitting that the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had instead loved me contingently, based on my willingness to become who they wanted rather than discovering who I was. But lying there in Alexander's guest room, cared for by someone who valued my authentic self, I began to wonder if the love I was so afraid of losing was worth the price I had been paying to keep it. And more fundamentally, whether conditional love was really love at all, or simply a transaction where I traded my autonomy for approval that was always temporary and never quite sufficient. These were dangerous thoughts, the kind that led to fundamental questions about identity and loyalty and obligation. I was not ready yet to fully confront them or act on the implications they carried. But the seeds had been planted, and I sensed that my carefully maintained double life was approaching a crisis point that would force me to finally choose between the daughter my parents wanted and the woman I had become despite their expectations. The first 3 days of recovery passed in a haze of pain medication, careful movement, and Alexander's quiet attentiveness. He worked from his home office during the day, checking on me regularly with a professional efficiency that somehow never felt clinical or detached. He prepared meals that were gentle on my recovering digestive system, helped me navigate the basics of personal care when I was too weak to manage alone, and created an environment where I could heal without feeling like a burden. My parents called twice during those first days. Both times I let the calls go to voicemail, unable to summon the energy to navigate their expectations while managing my physical recovery. Their messages followed a predictable pattern. My mother's voice oscillated between worried concern and barely masked accusation, asking why I was not returning their calls and reminding me that family should come first. My father's single message was characteristically brief, informing me that I was being childish, and that they expected an apology for my disrespectful behavior. I did not return the calls. Instead, I found myself thinking about the years that had led me to this point, examining with new clarity the ways my relationship with my parents had shaped every major decision of my adult life. The pain medication loosened the careful narratives I had constructed, allowing memories to surface without the usual filters of guilt and obligation that colored my understanding of the past. On the 4th morning, I woke feeling substantially better. The sharp pain had diminished to a dull ache, and I was able to move around the apartment with increasing independence. Alexander had left early for a meeting at the office that could not be postponed, leaving me a detailed note about where to find breakfast and strict instructions to call him immediately if I needed anything. I made my way to the kitchen slowly, marveling at the luxury of Alexander's apartment in the morning light. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of the city stretching toward the harbor, and the open-plan design created a sense of spaciousness that felt almost excessive compared to my modest apartment across town. Everything was elegant and expensive, but also somehow comfortable, reflecting Alexander's particular combination of wealth and understated taste. While waiting for tea to steep, I found myself drawn to the built-in bookshelves that lined one wall of the living room. They revealed an eclectic collection that spoke to broad interests beyond business strategy. Philosophy texts sat beside contemporary fiction. Biographies of historical figures shared space with books on architecture and design. I noticed a worn collection of poetry by Seamus Heaney, its spine creased from repeated reading, and found myself wondering what Alexander found in those verses during private moments. One shelf held framed photographs that I had never noticed during previous visits to his apartment for work purposes. Most showed Alexander at various ages with a young girl who must be his sister. There was one formal portrait of what were clearly his parents, taken perhaps months before the accident that made him an orphan. His father had the same sharp intelligence evident in Alexander's eyes, while his mother's smile suggested warmth and humor. The photograph carried a weight of loss that made my chest tighten with sympathy. My phone rang suddenly, shattering the quiet contemplation. My mother's name appeared on the screen, and this time I answered, knowing I could not avoid the conversation indefinitely. "Maya, finally. I have been trying to reach you for days. What is going on with you?" Her voice carried the particular edge that indicated she was working herself up to a lecture. "I have been recovering from surgery, Mom. I needed time to rest." Rest is one thing. Ignoring your parents is something else entirely. We have been worried sick. Your father has barely been able to focus on work. The redirection was immediate and familiar, transforming my recovery into their suffering. "I am sorry you were worried," I said carefully, choosing my words with deliberate precision. "I needed some space to heal." "Space from your family? That is not how we raised you, Maya. Family takes care of each other. We should be the ones helping you recover, not some coworker you barely know." The assumption that I barely knew Alexander, that my relationship with him was casual and superficial compared to family bonds, revealed how little my parents understood about my actual life. Alexander knew me better than they did in many fundamental ways because he knew the person I actually was rather than the version I performed for their approval. The person helping me is someone I trust, and who has been incredibly supportive. I am grateful for their help. I deliberately kept the pronoun neutral, unwilling to reveal Alexander's identity and open that complication. "You trust a coworker more than your own parents? After everything we have done for you?" The hurt in her voice was genuine, I could hear that clearly. But so was the manipulation embedded in the question, the implication that gratitude for past sacrifices obligated me to accept current mistreatment. "Mom, can we please not do this right now? I am still recovering, and I do not have the energy for this conversation." "Fine. When you are ready to remember who raised you and supported you and sacrificed everything so you could have opportunities, then we can talk. Until then, I suppose we will just have to wait for our ungrateful daughter to remember her family." The line went dead before I could respond. I set the phone down with shaking hands, the familiar guilt warring with a newer emotion that felt like clarity. My mother's words were designed to make me feel selfish and ungrateful for having needs that inconvenienced her narrative. The pattern was so practiced, so automatic, that she probably did not even recognize she was doing it. I thought back to my teenage years, that crucial period when I had begun to develop a sense of self separate from my parents' expectations. Those years had been a minefield of conflict and control disguised as concern and guidance. High school had been particularly challenging. I attended a competitive public school where academic achievement was expected and college preparation began in freshman year. My parents had specific ideas about which activities would look good on college applications and which were frivolous wastes of time. When I expressed interest in joining the debate team, my father had dismissed it as unnecessary since I was not planning to pursue law. When I wanted to take an elective in business and entrepreneurship, my mother had insisted I take advanced biology instead. I had complied with most of their directives, learning early that resistance led to lectures about sacrifice and obligation that lasted for hours. But I had also begun to develop small rebellions, secret acts of autonomy that felt like breathing spaces in an otherwise suffocating environment. I remembered particularly vividly the summer before my junior year. My school offered a prestigious internship program where students could work with local businesses and organizations to gain real-world experience. I had applied to work at a startup technology company doing market research and competitive analysis. When I was accepted, I had been thrilled. seeing it as validation of my business interests and an opportunity to explore a potential career path. My parents had forbidden me from accepting the position. The company was too small and unestablished, they argued. The work was not serious or academic enough. Most importantly, it would take time away from SAT preparation and the volunteer work at the hospital they had arranged for me to do instead. I had tried to argue to explain how valuable the experience would be and how much I wanted the opportunity. My father had cut me off with a sharp gesture, his voice taking on the tone that meant discussion was over. Maya, you are 16 years old. You do not know what is good for you yet. Your mother and I have lived longer and know more about the world. When we tell you something is not right for you, you need to trust that we know better. But I want to do this, I had protested, tears of frustration starting to form. It matters to me. What matters is your future, my mother had interjected. Not what you want right now. 16-year-olds want lots of things that are not good for them. That is why you have parents to guide you. The internship opportunity had passed to another student, while I spent my summer volunteering at a hospital where I felt awkward and out of place, pushing meal carts and making small talk with patients while my mind wandered to the work I could have been doing instead. The experience had reinforced my parents' conviction that I was meant for medicine. For me, it had confirmed that I wanted nothing to do with the medical field but lacked the power to act on that knowledge. The pattern had repeated throughout high school with variations on the same theme. I wanted to take computer science as an elective. They insisted on chemistry instead. I wanted to attend a summer program for young entrepreneurs. They enrolled me in a medical research camp. I wanted to explore my interest in strategic thinking and business analysis. They directed me toward pre-medical activities that felt like wearing someone else's clothes, technically fitting but fundamentally wrong. By senior year, I had developed a sophisticated system of small deceptions and strategic omissions. I would tell my parents I was studying at the library when I was actually attending meetings of a business club I had joined without their knowledge. I created elaborate excuses to explain why I needed to use the computer for extended periods, using homework as cover while I taught myself about financial analysis and market research through online courses and articles. The college application process had been the culmination of years of mounting tension. My parents had created a list of acceptable schools, all with strong pre-medical programs and connections to prestigious medical schools. I had applied to those schools as directed but also secretly applied to universities with exceptional business programs, using fee waivers and application fee money I had earned from a tutoring job my parents knew nothing about. When acceptance letters began arriving in the spring, I had intercepted the mail daily, hiding the acceptances from business programs, while sharing only the results my parents wanted to see. I had been accepted to every school on their list and several more on mine. The deception had felt necessary for survival, a way to keep future possibilities open even as I appeared to comply with their expectations. Northwestern had been my compromise choice, a school that appeared on both lists. My parents saw it as an excellent pre-medical program with strong research opportunities. I saw it as a university with a world-class business school, and the possibility of pursuing my actual interests once I was far enough from home to make my own decisions. The day I left for college remained vivid in my memory. My parents had driven me from New Jersey to Illinois, their car packed with carefully selected dorm furnishings and supplies. My mother had cried as she helped me arrange my room, repeating advice about studying hard and not getting distracted by social activities. My father had been characteristically stoic, reminding me that they were sacrificing a great deal to send me to such an expensive school, and that I had a responsibility to make the most of the opportunity. "We are so proud of you," my mother had said as they prepared to leave. "Our daughter, the future doctor. Your father and I talk about it all the time with our friends. Patricia's daughter is in marketing, can you imagine? But our Maya is going to save lives." The weight of their expectations had felt crushing even then. I was 18 years old and already living a lie, accepted to a prestigious university not as myself but as the daughter they had constructed through years of careful shaping and control. The person I actually was, with interests and passions that diverged from their vision, existed only in secret moments and private dreams. My first year at Northwestern had been a revelation and a challenge in equal measure. The freedom to make my own decisions about classes, activities, and time management was intoxicating. But that freedom came with the constant anxiety of managing my parents' expectations, while pursuing my authentic interests. I had enrolled in the required pre-medical courses, sitting through lectures on organic chemistry and cellular biology. While my mind wandered to the business strategy concepts I was exploring in my elective courses. I maintained the grades my parents expected, not because the material engaged me but because failure was not an option. Each A in a science course felt hollow, an achievement that brought no joy because it moved me further along a path I did not want to travel. Meanwhile, my business courses felt like coming alive after years of sleep. I remember particularly the first day of introduction to strategic management, sitting in a lecture hall as Professor Catherine Wells outlined the course objectives. She spoke about competitive advantage, market positioning, and organizational design with an infectious enthusiasm that made even complex concepts feel accessible and exciting. The first assignment had been to analyze a struggling retail company and develop a strategic recommendation for turning the business around. I had thrown myself into the project with an intensity that surprised even me, spending hours researching the industry, analyzing financial statements, and developing a comprehensive turnaround strategy. When I presented my findings in the discussion section, the teaching assistant had been impressed enough to share my work with Professor Wells. She had called me to her office the following week, my analysis spread across her desk along with notes she had made in the margins. I had been terrified that I was in trouble, that my enthusiasm had somehow crossed a line into presumption. Instead, Professor Wells had smiled warmly and gestured for me to sit. Maya, this work is exceptional. The depth of analysis, the creative thinking about market repositioning, the attention to both financial and operational considerations, this is graduate-level strategic thinking from a freshman student. Her praise had felt different from the academic recognition I had received before. This was validation of something I had chosen rather than something I had been directed toward. This was acknowledgement of my authentic interests and abilities, rather than my capacity to meet someone else's expectations. Have you considered pursuing business more seriously? She had asked. You clearly have a gift for strategic analysis. I had explained my situation carefully, the pre-medical track I was officially following, the family expectations that shaped my academic choices. Professor Wells had listened without judgment, nodding occasionally as I outlined the constraints I was navigating. Family expectations are important, she had said finally, but so is honoring your own talents and interests. You might consider exploring both paths for now, keeping your options open. Sometimes the right choice becomes clearer with more information and experience. Her advice had been practical and non-judgmental, acknowledging the complexity of my situation without pressuring me to choose one path over another immediately. I had left her office feeling validated but also uncertain, aware that I was approaching a crossroads that would eventually require a definitive choice. The pattern had continued through my sophomore year. I maintained my pre-medical coursework while adding economics as a second major, carefully framing the additional classes as helpful for understanding healthcare systems when my parents asked questions. I volunteered at a campus organization that connected students with local nonprofits, telling my parents it was medical-related volunteering, while actually working on strategic planning for small organizations that needed help optimizing their operations. I had become increasingly skilled at managing dual narratives, tailoring my communications to different audiences. Phone calls with my parents focused exclusively on my science courses, research opportunities, and preparation for medical school applications. Conversations with professors and classmates revealed my growing interest in business strategy and organizational design. The two versions of Maya existed in carefully separated worlds, and I worked constantly to maintain the boundaries between them. The summer after sophomore year had brought another crisis point. I had applied for and been accepted to a competitive consulting internship in Chicago, working for a mid-sized firm that specialized in strategic planning for technology companies. The opportunity was exactly what I wanted, a chance to apply business concepts to real-world problems and build experience in my field of interest. I had also been accepted to a research position in a neuroscience laboratory that my parents had helped me apply for through a family friend. The research was legitimate and valuable, studying neural pathways related to memory formation. It would look excellent on medical school applications. It was also something I had absolutely no interest in pursuing. The choice should have been simple. I wanted the consulting internship. I had earned the consulting internship through my own work and merit. But choosing it meant openly defying my parents' expectations and potentially revealing the full extent of my divergent interests. I had spent weeks agonizing over the decision, running through scenarios and trying to find compromise solutions that did not exist. Finally, I had called my parents to explain that I had been offered an opportunity to work with a healthcare consulting firm, carefully framing the business work as related to medical systems and hospital administration. My mother had been immediately suspicious. Consulting? That does not sound like medical research, Maya. How will this help you get into medical school? It is healthcare focused, I had insisted, stretching the truth past its breaking point. Understanding the business side of medicine is important for doctors. Hospitals are complex organizations that need strategic planning. My father had weighed in, his voice skeptical. This sounds like a distraction from your real goals. You should be in a laboratory learning research methods, not sitting in meetings talking about business. The conversation had escalated into an argument that lasted over an hour, my parents insisting I decline the consulting offer and accept the research position, me trying desperately to defend my choice without revealing the full extent of my business interests. In the end, I had been forced to choose, to explicitly defy their directive or abandon an opportunity that mattered deeply to me. I had chosen the consulting internship, hanging up the phone on my mother's tears and my father's cold anger. The guilt had been overwhelming, but so had been the sense of finally asserting my own will against their control. That summer in Chicago had been transformative, confirming that business strategy was not just an interest but a calling, something I was genuinely talented at and passionate about pursuing. But it had also cemented the pattern of deception that would define my relationship with my parents for years to come. I had learned that open honesty led to conflict and attempted control, while careful omission and strategic framing allowed me to pursue my authentic path while maintaining a superficial peace. The cost of that peace was living two separate lives, presenting different versions of myself to different audiences, and carrying the constant anxiety of managing information to prevent my worlds from colliding. Now, standing in Alexander's kitchen 5 years later, I could see clearly how those experiences had shaped my current situation. The habit of hiding my true career and achievements from my parents had become so automatic that I had maintained it, even after graduating and building a successful career. The fear of their disapproval and disappointment was so deeply ingrained that I had created elaborate systems to avoid confronting them with reality. My phone buzzed with a text message from Jessica asking how I was feeling and whether I needed anything. Her message was simple and straightforward. No hidden accusations or emotional manipulation. The contrast with my mother's earlier call was striking. I responded that I was recovering well and would be back at my own apartment in a few days. Jessica replied immediately with heart emojis and an offer to bring groceries whenever I needed them. Simple kindness offered without expectation or obligation, so different from the transactional nature of my relationship with my parents. Alexander returned from his office meeting around noon, carrying takeout from a restaurant known for healthy, carefully prepared meals. He found me sitting in the living room with my laptop, reviewing documents for a strategic project that could not wait for my full recovery. "You should be resting," he said, though his tone suggested he had expected to find me working. "I am resting," I countered. "I am sitting down while I work. That counts as resting." He smiled slightly, setting up lunch on the dining table and waiting until I joined him before beginning to eat. We discussed the Pemberton acquisition deal and some challenges that had emerged in negotiations, slipping easily into the professional dynamic that characterized our relationship under normal circumstances. But something had shifted during the days I had spent recovering in his home. The boundaries between professional and personal had become blurred in ways that could not be easily restored. He had seen me vulnerable and dependent, had cared for me through painful moments and helped me with basic needs when I was too weak to manage alone. That kind of intimacy created connections that transcended typical professional relationships. "Your parents called again," I said finally, setting down my fork. "My mother is upset that I have not come crawling back to apologize for inconveniencing them with my medical emergency." Alexander was quiet for a moment, considering his response carefully. "Can I ask you something that might be difficult?" I nodded, bracing myself. "What would happen if you just told them the truth? About your actual job, your real career, everything you have accomplished. What is the worst outcome you can imagine?" The question struck at the heart of fears I had been avoiding for years. They would be devastated, betrayed. They have been telling everyone they know that their daughter is preparing for medical school, building this narrative of my success that fits their definition of achievement. Finding out I have been lying to them for years while building a career they consider beneath me would destroy their trust and probably our relationship. And the alternative? Alexander pressed gently. Continuing to hide who you really are indefinitely? Living two separate lives forever? I do not know, I admitted. I keep thinking maybe eventually I will find the right time. The right way to tell them that will make them understand. But that time never seems to arrive. Perhaps because there is no right way to tell someone a truth they do not want to hear, Alexander suggested. Perhaps the question is not about finding the perfect moment or the perfect explanation, but about deciding whether living authentically is worth risking their conditional approval. His words echoed in my mind long after lunch was over, and he had returned to his office for afternoon meetings. I found myself unable to focus on work, my thoughts circling around questions I had been avoiding for years. Who was I really? The dutiful daughter who pursued medicine to honor her parents' sacrifices? Or the strategic thinker who had built a successful career in business against their wishes? Could I be both, or did choosing one mean abandoning the other? The medication made everything feel slightly distant and contemplative, thoughts flowing without the usual mental filters that kept uncomfortable questions at bay. I found myself imagining alternative histories, versions of my life where I had been brave enough to openly defy my parents after graduating, where I had introduced them to my real work and refused to hide my achievements to protect their feelings. In those imagined scenarios, sometimes they came to accept my choices, growing to understand that success could take many forms. Other times, they cut me off completely, unable to forgive the betrayal of their expectations. Both possibilities carried weight, both contained loss and potential liberation. But sitting in Alexander's apartment, recovering from surgery my parents could not handle witnessing, cared for by someone who valued my authentic self, I began to wonder whether the choice was already made. Perhaps I had been choosing all along, each deception and omission a vote for my real life over the one my parents had planned for me. Perhaps the question was not whether to choose but whether to acknowledge the choice I had already been making for years. The sun was setting over the city, casting long shadows across the apartment when Alexander returned. He found me still sitting in the living room, my laptop closed beside me, lost in thought. "You look like you are wrestling with something," he observed, settling into the chair across from me. "I am realizing that I have been living with a question for years that might not actually be a question anymore," I said slowly. "I have been asking myself whether I should tell my parents the truth about my career. But maybe the real question is whether I am ready to accept the consequences of telling them." Alexander nodded slowly, understanding the distinction. "And are you ready?" "I do not know yet," I admitted. "But I think I am closer than I have ever been." By the end of my first week of recovery, I had regained enough strength to return to my own apartment. Alexander had been reluctant to see me leave, expressing concern about my ability to manage stairs and daily tasks without assistance. But I had insisted, needing to reclaim some sense of independence and normalcy after days of vulnerability and dependence. Jessica had helped me settle back in, stocking my refrigerator with easy-to-prepare meals and arranging pillows on my couch to support my still-healing incision. She had asked careful questions about my time at Alexander's apartment, her curiosity evident but respectfully contained. I had offered vague explanations about his helpfulness and the convenience of his ground-floor guest room, skirting around the emotional complexity of those days. My parents had sent flowers to my apartment with a card that read simply, "Get well soon. We love you." No apology for leaving the hospital. No acknowledgement of the hurt their abandonment had caused. Just a generic sentiment and expensive flowers that felt more like obligation than genuine care. I had sent a brief thank you text, maintaining the minimal contact that seemed to satisfy their need for filial response without requiring me to engage with the underlying issues between us. The distance felt both necessary and painful, a protective barrier that also represented a kind of loss. Returning to work after 2 weeks of medical leave brought its own challenges and revelations. I had been working remotely during my recovery, attending video meetings from Alexander's apartment and then my own managing projects from my laptop while carefully protecting my healing incision. But being back in the office physically was different, requiring me to navigate the social dynamics and professional expectations that had been temporarily suspended during my medical crisis. My team had been supportive and understanding, covering my responsibilities during my absence and welcoming me back with genuine warmth. David, my second-in-command in the Strategic Initiatives Division, had managed several critical projects flawlessly, demonstrating leadership capabilities that I made note of for future opportunities. The work itself was engaging and demanding, pulling me back into the rhythm of analysis and strategic planning that had always felt like the most authentic expression of my capabilities. But the return to normal professional life also meant resuming the careful compartmentalization that had characterized my existence for years. At work, I was Maya Chan, Director of Strategic Initiatives, known for innovative thinking and successful project execution. At home, in phone calls with my parents, I remained Maya Chan, the daughter still theoretically preparing for medical school applications, working a modest marketing job that was just a temporary detour on the path they had planned. The cognitive dissonance of maintaining these separate identities had always created stress, but after the clarity of my recovery period, the deception felt more burdensome than ever. Alexander's questions during those vulnerable days had planted seeds of doubt about the sustainability of my approach, and I found myself increasingly exhausted by the mental gymnastics required to keep my world separate. 3 weeks after my surgery, my mother called with news that brought the simmering tension to an immediate boil. Her voice was bright with excitement, the particular enthusiasm she reserved for announcing developments she considered significant achievements. Maya, wonderful news. I have been talking with Dr. Susan Wong, you remember her. She is the thoracic surgeon whose daughter went to your high school. She has agreed to write you a recommendation letter for medical school applications. She is quite prestigious on the board at Memorial Hospital, and her endorsement will be very valuable. My stomach dropped. I had been vaguely aware that my parents continued to tell people I was preparing for medical school, but I had not realized they were actively taking steps to facilitate applications I had no intention of submitting. Mom, that is not necessary. I have not even taken the MCAT yet. The excuse was weak, buying time rather than addressing the fundamental problem. Well, that is the other thing I wanted to discuss. Your father and I have been looking at MCAT preparation courses. There is an excellent intensive program this summer that guarantees score improvement. We would be happy to pay for it as an investment in your future. The conversation was accelerating toward a crisis point I was not prepared to handle. My mother was making concrete plans based on a future that did not exist, committing resources and social capital to supporting a path I had abandoned years ago. The kindness behind her actions, the genuine belief that she was helping me achieve success, made the deception feel even more unbearable. Mom, can we talk about this later? I am still recovering from surgery and trying to catch up at work. This feels like a lot to process right now. Of course, darling. I know you have been through a difficult time, but we should start planning soon. Medical school applications are incredibly competitive, and we want to give you every advantage. Her voice carried absolute certainty, no shadow of doubt about the future she was describing. After ending the call, I sat at my desk staring at financial projections for a market expansion initiative, unable to focus on the numbers in front of me. My mother's enthusiastic planning for a medical career I would never pursue felt like a countdown to inevitable confrontation. I could not let her invest more time, money, and social capital in facilitating a path I had no intention of following. The deception had crossed from passive omission into active complicity in building false expectations. Alexander found me still sitting motionless 20 minutes later, my laptop screen dark from inactivity. He knocked lightly on my office door frame before entering, his expression shifting from professional inquiry to concern when he saw my face. "What happened?" he asked, closing the door behind him and settling into the chair across from my desk. I explained the conversation with my mother, her plans for MCAT preparation and medical school recommendations, the accelerating momentum toward a future built entirely on lies. Alexander listened without interrupting, his analytical mind clearly processing the implications and complications. "You are going to have to tell them," he said finally, his tone gentle but firm. This has progressed beyond sustainable deception. Your mother is making real investments based on false information. The longer you wait, the worse the eventual revelation will be. I know, I admitted, the words feeling like surrender. I have known for a long time. I just keep hoping for some magical solution where I can tell them the truth without destroying our relationship. That solution does not exist, Alexander said bluntly. You have two choices. Continue the deception indefinitely, and accept the constant stress and inevitable disaster when your worlds collide accidentally. Or choose a time and method for revealing the truth on your terms, accepting that it will be painful but also liberating. His framing was characteristically clear and strategic, reducing complex emotional dynamics to a decision tree with quantifiable outcomes. It was one of the qualities that made him an exceptional CEO, the ability to see past emotional complexity to underlying structural realities. It was also sometimes frustrating in its refusal to acknowledge that some situations resisted rational analysis. What if telling them destroys everything? I asked, voicing the fear that had paralyzed me for years. What if they cannot forgive me for lying, for pursuing a career they consider beneath me, for choosing my own path over their expectations? Then you will know that their love was conditional on your compliance, Alexander replied, his words landing with uncomfortable precision. And you will be free to build a life with people who love you for who you actually are rather than who they want you to be. The stark clarity of his statement cut through years of rationalizations and excuses. He was right, of course. My fear of losing my parents' approval revealed my understanding that their love was contingent on my meeting their expectations. Genuine unconditional love would not require me to hide my authentic self and achievements to maintain connection. But understanding this intellectually did not diminish the emotional weight of potentially losing the only family I had. My parents were flawed and controlling, unable to see past their own vision for my life. But they were also the people who had raised me, who had sacrificed genuine hardships to provide opportunities, who loved me according to their limited capacity for understanding. Accepting that their love was conditional felt like acknowledging a fundamental loss that had existed all along, but that I had been unwilling to fully recognize. That evening, I sat in my apartment with a bottle of wine I was not supposed to drink given my recent surgery and my pain medication, staring at my phone and debating whether to call my parents immediately or continue delaying the inevitable. The conversation with Alexander had crystallized something that had been building throughout my recovery. I could not sustain the double life indefinitely. The appendicitis and surgery had been random medical events, but they had also been a warning about the precariousness of my situation. My carefully separated worlds had nearly collided when I was too vulnerable and incapacitated to manage the revelation strategically. Instead of calling my parents, I found myself opening my laptop and beginning to write. The document started as a letter explaining my actual career, the strategic work I did at Thornton Global, the achievements I had accumulated over 4 years of building systems and frameworks that had contributed to the company's success. I detailed the summer internship that had led to a full-time offer, the decision to pursue business strategy rather than medical school, the reasons I had hidden this path from them for so long. The writing felt cathartic, giving shape and structure to truths I had been carrying silently for years. I wrote about the conflict between their expectations and my authentic interests, the ways their constant criticism and control had taught me that honesty led to conflict while deception provided peace. I wrote about the guilt I carried for lying to them, and the resentment I felt toward their inability to see or value who I actually was. By the time I finished, the document was 12 pages long, far too detailed and emotionally raw to actually send. But the process of writing had clarified my thinking, helping me understand what I needed to communicate and what underlying dynamics had created the current crisis. I saved the document with the intention of revising it into something more measured and strategic, a clear explanation that acknowledged my deception, while also asserting my right to make my own choices. The next morning, I woke to a text message from my mother that made my carefully planned approach immediately irrelevant. Your father and I are coming to visit this weekend. We want to see how you are recovering and discuss your medical school plans. We will stay at the Marriott downtown and take you to dinner Saturday night. The message was framed as a notification rather than a request, the assumption that I would rearrange my life to accommodate their visit evident in the casual tone. Under normal circumstances, I would have agreed immediately, grateful for their attention and willing to manage the logistics of presenting my false life for their inspection. But something had shifted during my recovery, some fundamental recalibration of my willingness to contort myself to maintain their comfortable illusions. I called Alexander before responding to my mother, needing to talk through the implications and options. He answered immediately despite the early hour, his voice alert and focused in the way that suggested he had already been awake and working. "They are coming this weekend," I told him without preamble. "My mother just informed me they are visiting to discuss medical school plans. Are you going to tell them the truth?" His question was direct, cutting through anxiety to the central decision point. "I do not know. Part of me thinks this is the perfect opportunity, a face-to-face conversation where I can explain everything and deal with their reactions directly. Another part of me wants to cancel the visit entirely, to buy more time to prepare." "What does preparing look like?" Alexander asked. "What would need to be different for you to feel ready to have this conversation?" His question revealed the flaw in my delaying logic. No amount of preparation would make the conversation easy or guarantee a positive outcome. I was not waiting for the right time. I was simply avoiding a painful inevitability. "Nothing would be different," I admitted. "I am just scared." "That is understandable and reasonable," Alexander said. "This is a frightening conversation with potentially significant consequences. But fear is not a good enough reason to continue living a lie that is making you miserable." We talked for another 30 minutes, Alexander helping me think through various approaches and scenarios. He offered to be present during the conversation if I wanted support, a gesture that touched me deeply even as I recognized it would complicate an already difficult situation. Eventually, I thanked him and ended the call, still uncertain about what I would do, but feeling slightly less alone in facing the decision. I responded to my mother's text with a carefully neutral message confirming that I had received her notification and would see them Saturday evening. I did not commit to discussing medical school plans or indicate any enthusiasm about the visit. The response was minimally polite, meeting the basic requirements of filial acknowledgement without performing the eager gratitude she typically expected. Her reply came quickly, a string of messages expressing excitement about seeing me and listing restaurants she had researched for our dinner. The enthusiasm felt exhausting, her obliviousness to the tension between us evident in every exclamation point and cheerful emoji. She was planning a celebratory visit, while I was contemplating whether to detonate our entire relationship with revelations she was completely unprepared to receive. The days leading up to their visit passed in a blur of anxiety and strategic planning. I cleaned my apartment obsessively, removing any evidence of my actual career that might prompt questions I was not ready to answer. I hid business books and strategy documents, stored my laptop in a drawer rather than leaving it visible on my desk, and generally created the sterile environment of someone whose life was on hold rather than actively thriving. The contradiction between the careful erasure of my authentic life and my intention to possibly reveal the truth was not lost on me. I was simultaneously preparing to tell them everything and creating conditions that would allow continued deception. The ambivalence reflected my genuine uncertainty about whether I was ready to accept the consequences of honesty. Saturday arrived with unusually perfect weather, bright sunshine and comfortable temperatures that felt at odds with my internal turmoil. I spent the morning working from home, trying to focus on a competitive analysis report that required careful attention. But my mind kept drifting to the evening ahead, running through possible conversation scenarios and imagining different outcomes. Alexander called around noon to check on me, offering again to be available if I needed support. I declined but felt grateful for the offer, touched by his willingness to involve himself in my messy family dynamics. Our relationship had evolved significantly since my surgery, the professional boundaries we had carefully maintained for years increasingly difficult to define or enforce. We had not discussed the shift explicitly, both of us seeming to recognize that naming it would require decisions neither of us was quite ready to make. My parents arrived at the restaurant 15 minutes early, already seated at a prominent table when I walked in. My mother stood immediately when she saw me, her face lighting with a smile that carried genuine warmth alongside the usual critical assessment. My father remained seated but nodded approvingly, his version of affectionate greeting. "Maya darling, you look so thin. Are you eating properly? Recovery from surgery requires good nutrition." My mother's first words were characteristically critical, concern expressed through identification of inadequacy. I had lost a few pounds during my illness and recovery, but my appearance was healthy and appropriate. Her comment was less about actual concern and more about establishing the familiar dynamic where she identified problems and I accepted her assessment. I am eating fine, Mom. The doctors are happy with my recovery. We settled into our seats and ordered drinks, the conversation flowing through safe topics with practiced ease. My parents asked about my work, and I offered the usual vague descriptions of my supposed marketing role. My mother shared gossip about people from our New Jersey community, updates on the daughters of her friends who were achieving the kinds of milestones she wished I was reaching. My father discussed his accounting firm and some challenging client situations he was navigating. The performance was so familiar that I could have conducted it while thinking about something else entirely. I knew which details to emphasize, which questions to deflect, how to present just enough information to satisfy their curiosity without revealing anything substantive. The skill was so practiced it felt almost automatic. Muscle memory developed through years of careful deception. But underneath the smooth surface, something was different. I was watching the interaction from a slight distance, seeing clearly how much energy I expended on managing their perceptions, and how little actual connection resulted from our carefully choreographed conversations. We were performing the roles of loving family without the substance of genuine intimacy or understanding. The shift came after our entrees arrived, when my mother set down her fork and fixed me with a particular expression that indicated a serious topic was about to be introduced. Maya, your father and I want to discuss your plans for medical school applications. We have been doing research and there are several things we need to address. Here was the moment, the opening where I could either continue the deception or finally speak the truth I had been carrying for years. My heart was racing, adrenaline flooding my system as I faced the choice Alexander had articulated so clearly. Continue the comfortable lie or risk everything for authentic honesty. Actually, Mom, Dad, there is something I need to tell you about my career plans. My voice was steadier than I felt. Years of strategic presentations in high-pressure business situations, lending me a professional composure that masked my internal panic. My mother's expression shifted slightly, concern replacing enthusiasm. What do you mean? You are still planning to apply to medical school, are you not? No, I said simply, the single word carrying years of hidden truth. I am not applying to medical school. I have never planned to apply to medical school. I have been working in business strategy for the past 4 years, and that is the career I intend to continue pursuing. The silence that followed was absolute, my parents frozen in expressions of confused disbelief. I could see them processing my words, trying to reconcile this statement with everything they believed about my life and plans. I do not understand, my father said finally, his voice carefully controlled. You have been taking pre-medical courses. You have been preparing for the MCAT. What are you talking about, business strategy? I stopped taking pre-medical courses after my sophomore year of college, I explained, my carefully rehearsed explanation beginning to tumble out. I switched to economics and business courses because that is what I am actually interested in and good at. When I graduated, I accepted a position at Thornton Global Industries working in their strategic planning division. That is what I have been doing for the past 4 years, not marketing like I told you. My mother's face had gone pale, her hand gripping her water glass so tightly I worried it might shatter. You have been lying to us for 4 years? About your job? About your career? About everything? Yes, I admitted, the confession feeling like stepping off a cliff into unknown space. I have been lying because I knew you would not approve of my choices, and I could not face your disappointment and criticism, so I built the career I wanted while telling you what you wanted to hear. The conversation that followed was everything I had feared and worse. My parents cycled through shock, hurt, anger and betrayal, their voices rising despite the public setting. Other diners glanced toward our table with curiosity or concern as my mother's composure cracked, and my father's controlled demeanor gave way to expressions of profound disappointment. My mother kept returning to the deception itself, less focused on my career choice than on the fact that I had lied for years. How could you do this to us? We are your parents. We have given you everything, sacrificed so much for your opportunities, and this is how you repay us? With lies and deception? My father's reaction was colder and somehow more cutting. If you did not want to pursue medicine, you should have told us directly rather than sneaking around like a child. This behavior shows a fundamental lack of character and integrity. I raised you to be honest, and instead you have become someone I do not even recognize. I tried to explain the circumstances that had led to my choices, the years of criticism and control that had taught me honesty led to conflict. I described my genuine passion for strategic work and the success I had achieved in my field. I attempted to help them understand that my deception came from fear rather than malice, a desperate attempt to maintain their approval while pursuing my authentic path. But they were not ready to hear explanations or justifications. The revelation was too fresh, the sense of betrayal too acute for them to consider my perspective with any sympathy or understanding. The dinner dissolved into recriminations and hurt feelings, the careful restaurant meal abandoned as the conversation became too emotional and heated for public consumption. We left the restaurant separately, my parents returning to their hotel while I drove home alone, shaking with adrenaline and the aftermath of confrontation. The truth was finally out, the secret I had carried for years exposed in the most painful way possible. But instead of the liberation I had hoped might follow honesty, I felt only devastation and the sickening certainty that I had just destroyed my relationship with my parents in a way that might never heal. Back at my apartment, I called Alexander, needing to talk to someone who understood the context and significance of what had just happened. He answered immediately and listened without interruption as I recounted the dinner conversation in detail, my voice breaking multiple times as I relived the shock and hurt in my parents' faces. "I have ruined everything," I said finally, exhausted from crying and emotional overwhelm. "They hate me. They think I am a liar and a disappointment. All these years of trying to maintain their approval, and I have destroyed it in one conversation." "You have not ruined everything," Alexander said firmly. "You have finally told the truth after years of feeling forced to hide who you are. Their reaction is about their disappointment that reality does not match their expectations, not about you being a bad person or making wrong choices." "But I did lie to them. For years." "That is not nothing, Alexander. They have every right to feel betrayed." "They do have a right to feel hurt about the deception," he acknowledged. "But they also bear responsibility for creating conditions where you felt lying was the only way to maintain a relationship with them. Parents who truly support their children create space for honest communication, even about disappointing choices. Your parents have never given you that space." His words provided some comfort, but they could not erase the devastation of watching my parents' faces crumble as they processed my revelations. The dinner had been traumatic for all of us, destroying comfortable illusions and forcing confrontation with painful realities. What I did not know then was that the dinner conversation was only the beginning. The revelation of my career deception would set off a chain of events that would force even deeper confrontations and ultimately require me to make definitive choices about the kind of life I wanted to live and the kind of relationships I was willing to accept. The breaking point had arrived, and there was no returning to the comfortable lies that had sustained our family dynamic for years. The week following the disastrous dinner with my parents passed in a state of emotional numbness punctuated by moments of acute pain. They had returned to New Jersey without attempting further contact, their silence communicating disapproval more effectively than any words could have. I threw myself into work with an intensity that bordered on obsessive, using strategic analysis and project management as armor against the emotional devastation of our ruptured relationship. My team noticed the change in my demeanor but had the professionalism not to comment directly. David mentioned casually that I seemed to be pushing myself hard, and suggested I take advantage of the remaining medical leave I was entitled to use. I thanked him for the concern and continued working 12-hour days, finding solace in problems that could be solved through rational analysis rather than the messy emotional dynamics that had no clear solution. Alexander watched my spiral with evident concern but did not intervene directly for the first several days. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, my need to process grief and disappointment through work. But on Thursday afternoon of that terrible week, he appeared at my office door with an expression that suggested he was done allowing me to self-destruct quietly. "We need to talk," he said, closing the door behind him without waiting for invitation. "And not about the Pemberton deal or the Singapore expansion or any other work topic you have been using to avoid processing what happened with your parents." I wanted to protest that I was fine, that I was simply being productive and professional. But the exhaustion must have shown on my face because Alexander simply waited, his patience outlasting my reflexive defensiveness. I do not know how to feel, I admitted finally. I should feel relieved that the truth is finally out. But instead I just feel like I have destroyed the only family I have over career choices that should not have been this complicated in the first place. Alexander settled into the chair across from my desk, his posture suggesting he had no intention of leaving until we had worked through this conversation properly. Your parents have not contacted you at all since Saturday? Nothing. Complete silence. Which is somehow worse than anger or accusations. At least those would suggest they still care enough to engage with me. The silence is their way of punishing you, Alexander observed, making you feel the absence of their approval so acutely that you will be motivated to apologize and return to compliance with their expectations. His analysis was probably accurate, but hearing it stated so directly made something twist painfully in my chest. What if they never forgive me? What if I have permanently destroyed our relationship? Then you will have learned something important about the nature of their love, Alexander said quietly. People who genuinely love you can be hurt and disappointed, but ultimately want you to be happy and fulfilled. If your honesty about pursuing meaningful work destroys your relationship with them permanently, that suggests their love was always conditional on your compliance. The truth of his words did not make them easier to accept. I had spent my entire life working for my parents' approval, measuring my worth by their standards of success. The possibility that their love had always been contingent on my meeting their expectations felt like discovering that the foundation I had built my identity on was constructed of sand. I do not know who I am without their approval, I confessed, the admission emerging from some deep place I had been avoiding examining. Every achievement, every decision, I have always measured it against the question of whether it would make them proud. If they are not proud of me, if they do not even want to speak to me, then what does any of it mean? Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his sharp mind clearly working through how to respond to such a fundamental crisis of identity. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a gentleness I had rarely heard from him. Can I tell you what I see when I look at you, Maya? Not what your parents see or what you imagine they see, but what I actually observe. I nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in my throat. I see someone who identified her genuine talents and interests despite being told repeatedly that they were inadequate or unworthy. I see someone who worked harder than anyone else on my senior leadership team to prove herself, and who succeeded not through connections or privilege, but through sheer competence and strategic brilliance. I see someone who managed to build an extraordinary career while navigating impossible family pressures that would have broken most people. He leaned forward slightly, his intensity making me unable to look away. You designed the framework we used for our entire European expansion strategy. The renewable infrastructure financing model you developed is projected to generate over 300 million in revenue over the next 5 years. You identified the market opportunity in sustainable supply chain optimization before any of our competitors recognized the trend. These accomplishments have nothing to do with your parents' approval, and everything to do with your capability and vision. Tears were sliding down my face before I realized I was crying. Not from sadness but from the overwhelming experience of being truly seen. Alexander understood what I had accomplished in ways my parents never would, valued the work I did because he witnessed its impact directly rather than measuring it against abstract standards of prestige. Why are you telling me this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Because you need to hear it from someone whose opinion you respect. Because you need to understand that your worth is not determined by whether your parents approve of your choices. And because watching you destroy yourself over people who have never truly known or valued the real you is painful for those of us who do see and value who you actually are. The conversation shifted something fundamental in my understanding of the situation. My parents' silence was devastating, but it was not the only measure of my value or the legitimacy of my choices. I had built meaningful work and relationships based on my authentic self, and those accomplishments had worth independent of familial validation. We talked for another hour, Alexander sharing more about his own experience of building an identity separate from family expectations after his parents died. He described the years of feeling lost, trying to honor their memory while also pursuing paths they might not have chosen for him. His perspective, shaped by permanent loss rather than conditional approval, helped me see my situation with new clarity. Your parents are still alive, he said as our conversation drew to a close. There is time for them to grow and change, to potentially come to understand your choices differently. But that growth has to be their journey, not something you can force or earn through continued compliance. The question for you is whether you can build a life that feels meaningful and authentic regardless of whether they eventually come around. His words stayed with me through the rest of the week as I gradually emerged from the fog of grief and self-recrimination. I began to recognize that the disaster dinner, while painful, had also freed me from years of exhausting deception. I no longer had to maintain separate versions of myself for different audiences. I could simply be Maya Chan, strategic director at Thornton Global, without constantly monitoring my communications to avoid revealing forbidden truths. The following Monday brought an unexpected development that would catalyze the next phase of my journey. Alexander called me into his office for what I assumed would be a routine strategic planning meeting. Instead, I found him sitting at his conference table with a folder containing what appeared to be organizational charts and position descriptions. I want to talk to you about your role at Thornton Global, he began, gesturing for me to sit across from him. You have been directing strategic initiatives for 4 years with exceptional results. The board and I have been discussing creating a new position that reflects the scope and impact of your contributions. He slid the folder across to me, and I opened it to find a formal offer letter for the position of Vice President of Strategic Planning and Innovation. The title came with significantly increased compensation, equity in the company, and a seat in senior leadership meetings. It was the kind of promotion that represented validation of everything I had built since joining Thornton Global. This is contingent on board approval at next month's meeting, Alexander explained. But I wanted to discuss it with you first, to make sure you are interested before I formally present the recommendation. I stared at the offer letter, my mind racing through implications. This was exactly the kind of achievement I had dreamed about, concrete recognition of my capabilities and contributions. It was also the kind of success that would make my divergence from my parents' expectations even more stark and undeniable. Vice President at 28, I said slowly. That is significantly younger than typical for this level of leadership. You have earned it through performance, not tenure, Alexander replied. Age is irrelevant when someone has demonstrated the strategic capability and leadership potential you have shown. The board recognizes that you are critical to our continued growth, and wants to ensure you are appropriately compensated and positioned. What happens if I accept, and then fail to deliver at this level? The question revealed my lingering insecurity, the voice of my parents' criticism still echoing in my mind even after our rupture. Then we would address performance issues the same way we would with any executive, Alexander said matter-of-factly. But I am not offering you this position because I am uncertain about your capabilities. I am offering it because you have already been performing at this level for years. We are simply updating your title and compensation to match the reality of your contributions. I took the folder back to my office and spent the afternoon reviewing the formal offer in detail. The compensation was generous, the equity significant enough to represent life-changing wealth if Thornton Global continued its trajectory. The responsibilities aligned perfectly with the work I loved most, giving me autonomy to shape strategic direction across multiple divisions. But what struck me most was the accompanying letter from Alexander that outlined his rationale for the promotion. It detailed specific projects and initiatives I had led, quantifying the revenue impact and strategic value of my work. Reading his assessment of my contributions, I saw myself through his eyes for the first time, not as the disappointing daughter who had abandoned medicine for business, but as a legitimately exceptional strategic thinker whose work created measurable value. That evening I called Jessica and invited her out for dinner, needing to share the news with someone who would understand its significance. We met at our favorite neighborhood restaurant, a casual Italian place where we had celebrated numerous milestones over the years of our friendship. You look different, Jessica observed as soon as I sat down. Less exhausted than you have been since the surgery. I have news, I said, unable to contain the slight smile that had been building all afternoon. Alexander offered me a promotion to vice president. It comes with equity and a seat in senior leadership. Jessica's face lit with genuine excitement, and she grabbed my hands across the table with enthusiasm that made me laugh despite the complicated emotions swirling beneath my surface calm. Maya, that is incredible. Vice president at your age? That is huge. We need to celebrate properly. We ordered wine and appetizers, and I found myself describing the offer in detail, the responsibilities and opportunities it represented. Jessica listened with the attention of someone who genuinely cared about my success, asking thoughtful questions and celebrating aspects of the opportunity one had not fully appreciated myself. Have you told your parents? She asked eventually, her expression shifting to concern as she remembered the recent disaster. No, they are not speaking to me right now. I explained the revelation dinner briefly, sketching the essential facts without dwelling on the painful details. Jessica's response was characteristically direct. So let me understand this correctly. You just got promoted to vice president of a major company at 28 years old, which is an objectively incredible achievement. But instead of celebrating, you are worried about whether your parents, who have not bothered to call you in over a week, will approve? Put that way, the absurdity of my anxiety became clear. When you say it like that, it sounds ridiculous. It is ridiculous, Jessica said gently. Maya, I have known you for years. I have watched you work harder than anyone I know, building an impressive career while managing impossible family pressures. You are about to become a vice president because you earned it through talent and dedication. That accomplishment stands on its own regardless of whether your parents recognize it. Her words echoed Alexander's earlier observations, and I felt something shift in my understanding. Perhaps the people who actually knew me, who witnessed my work and capabilities directly, were better judges of my worth than parents who had never bothered to understand what I actually did or why it mattered. Over dinner, Jessica shared her own experience of managing family expectations that conflicted with personal choices. Her parents had divorced acrimoniously when she was young, and she had spent years navigating their competing demands and attempts to use her as a weapon against each other. She had eventually established firm boundaries, limiting contact to what felt manageable, and refusing to participate in their ongoing conflicts. It was the hardest thing I have ever done, she admitted, accepting that my parents were never going to be the supportive, healthy family I wanted. But it was also incredibly liberating. Once I stopped waiting for them to change and started building the life I wanted regardless of their approval, I became so much happier. Her perspective offered a model for how I might navigate my own family rupture. Perhaps the goal was not to repair the relationship to its previous state, but to establish a new dynamic based on reality rather than illusion. Perhaps I could build a fulfilling life that included my parents to whatever degree they were capable of healthy engagement, without making their approval the measure of my success or worth. We talked late into the evening, the conversation ranging across career ambitions, relationship dynamics, and the complex process of becoming fully adult in relationship to parents who want to keep treating you as a child. By the time we parted, I felt lighter than I had in weeks, the burden of familial disapproval somehow less crushing when balanced against genuine friendship and professional achievement. The next morning, I drafted my formal acceptance of the vice president position. The letter was professional and gracious, expressing appreciation for the opportunity and commitment to continuing to contribute to Thornton Global's strategic growth. I submitted it to Alexander with a sense of stepping irrevocably into my authentic identity, claiming publicly the role and responsibilities I had been performing privately for years. Alexander's response came within an hour. A brief email expressing satisfaction with my decision and confirming that he would present the recommendation to the board at their upcoming meeting. The formal tone of the message was appropriate for official business communication, but the final line revealed the personal dimension of his investment in my success. You have earned this opportunity, Maya. I look forward to working with you in this expanded capacity. The weeks leading up to the board meeting passed in a flurry of preparation. Alexander wanted me to present during the session where my promotion would be discussed, giving board members direct exposure to my strategic thinking and communication skills. I developed a comprehensive presentation on market opportunities in sustainable technology infrastructure, complete with detailed financial projections and competitive analysis. The preparation felt different from previous high-stakes presentations because the outcome would directly impact my career trajectory. Alexander coached me through multiple practice sessions, offering feedback on content and delivery with the same attention to detail he applied to major business decisions. His investment in my success was evident in every critique and suggestion, helping me refine the presentation until it was genuinely exceptional. My parents remained silent through this entire period. I had sent a brief email informing them of the promotion opportunity, hoping that professional success might bridge the gap created by my revelations. The email went unanswered, their continued silence communicating more clearly than words that my achievements in business held no value in their assessment of success. The rejection hurt, but it no longer devastated me the way it would have weeks earlier. Alexander and Jessica had helped me recognize that my worth was not contingent on familial approval. The work I did had objective value independent of whether my parents acknowledged it. I could build a meaningful life surrounded by people who saw and valued my authentic self, even if my parents were not among them. The board meeting was scheduled for the last Thursday of the month. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing a tailored suit that projected confidence and competence. Looking at myself in the mirror before leaving my apartment, I barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked assured and professional, ready to claim space in senior leadership rooms. She looked nothing like the anxious daughter constantly seeking approval from parents who were never satisfied. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.